children who rely upon state agencies and federal policy which oversees those state agencies as their last hope for safety. 2 years ago, I became a parent. And what we have learned is happening to children in the state's care and in the care of state agencies across the country is heartbreaking. Instead of safety, too many children have experienced neglect, abuse, apathy, humiliation, denied and delayed health care, human trafficking. I want to emphasize that this is an active and ongoing inquiry. Today, we will hear firsthand testimony from children and parents who have suffered from systemic failures to protect vulnerable children. We'll also hear from expert witnesses who will explain that these stories we hear today illustrate broader and long-standing failures to protect the most vulnerable children in Georgia and across the nation. I again thank Ranking Member Blackburn for her support and for her invaluable contributions to this bipartisan effort. I know, having worked closely with Senator Blackburn over the last year, how deeply she cares about the welfare of children. I have seen her passion displayed time and time again as an advocate for vulnerable children. And it is imperative that this work spur the long overdue reforms necessary both at the state level and in federal policy to protect America's most vulnerable children. I thank you all for your presence today and yield to Ranking Member Blackburn for her opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to begin by welcoming Senator Butler. We're delighted to have you as a part of our subcommittee and the Judiciary Committee, so welcome. We look forward to your participation, and I want to thank you all for being here. Each of our witnesses today, you've been open, you have testimony that we appreciate having, and we look forward to having your response to our questions as we move through today. I do thank Senator Ossoff and his team for the consistent work that they have done on this issue. Now, he mentioned that several months ago he started the investigation into what was happening with Georgia. And likewise, we looked at what was happening in Tennessee. That's important to do. These are the states that we represent, and looking at what is happening there is paramount to having an understanding of what is happening all across the country. And when we look at the foster care system, we know that the children that are there are not there because of something they have done. They are there because of situations or because of adults who have let them down, or a circumstance that has occurred in the life of a family. So what we have to do is make certain that these children, as Senator Ossoff said, the most vulnerable children, are not going to be let down by the system. And as our work here on the Human Rights Subcommittee, what we're doing is bringing this issue home and saying, let's start right here with where we are and look at the situations that are out there with children that are in our communities and in our states. And it is our duty to make certain that these children are going to be safe and that they are going to be protected from predators. They're going to be protected from traffickers, and that they know that they are surrounded by people who honestly care about them and care about their well-being. In February, I sent a letter over to the Tennessee Department of Children's Services expressing concern about several items. There was a 2022 finding and report regarding the agency's performance in protecting children that were in their care. In that letter, I expressed a commitment to work together with the state of Tennessee to better protect the children that are in the custody of DCS. Since that time, under the leadership of Commissioner Margie Quinn, the Department of Children's Services has undergone a complete and total overhaul. Commissioner Quinn, who, by the way, has done a phenomenal job in our state working on issues of children being trafficked, making certain that children are being protected. Here are some of the things that she has done, and Mr. Chairman, I think these are so instructive to us and to how we solve this problem of protecting children in the state's custody. Commissioner Quinn has cut case manager vacancies in half, causing the caseloads to drop dramatically. And as of March 2023, not a single child was being housed in DCS offices. Another big benchmark. Now, in Tennessee, the faith-based community had stepped up to really fill the gap to house children immediately when they enter state custody. And 48 more beds in a clinical and secure setting will be opened by the end of the calendar year. Of course, there's always more to be done to protect these vulnerable children. And Commissioner Quinn has put in the work that is necessary to get this department on the proper footing. And I believe her response to my letter highlights a lot of that good work. And Mr. Chairman, I do want to enter that for the record.
Without objection.
And I think that what we will see is what they have done when they were presented with this situation is to move forward with corrective action that can help so many other states, and it will be a model for states that have these persistent problems. Now, we can't talk about protecting our foster care children without talking about the individuals who make a profit off exploiting our children. Human traffickers target those who they perceive to be the most vulnerable among us. So it should be no surprise that children in the foster care system are disproportionately targeted for sex and labor trafficking. I look forward to hearing from our experts today on how we can close that pipeline, which we have to close that pipeline between the foster care system and human trafficking, because until we put an end to child trafficking, we cannot truly fulfill our commitment and our goal of making certain that these boys and girls that are in our care are going to be protected. Thank you so much, and thank you for your leadership.
Thank you, Ranking Member Blackburn, for your opening statement. And before we hear from those witnesses in our from those experts in our second panel, we're going to hear from two courageous witnesses in our first panel who have firsthand experiences interacting with the foster care system, Ranking Member Blackburn, in my home state of Georgia. Rachel Aldridge is the mother of Brooklyn Aldridge, who died in DFAC's custody in 2018 when Brooklyn was just 2 years old. Monet Houston is a 19-year-old from Savannah who recently signed out of DFAC's custody. Ms. Houston spent 5 years in 18 different placements, and only 2 of those placements were foster homes. The rest were group homes, institutions, or hotels. Before opening statements, it's the practice of the subcommittee to swear in witnesses. If you two please would kindly rise and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you are about to give before the subcommittee is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Please be seated. And Ms. Aldridge, it's now your turn to offer your opening statement. Please remember to hit that button to activate your microphone when you're ready. Thank you.
Chairman Ossoff, Ranking Member Blackburn, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Rachel Aldridge. I am only here today because of a broken system that led to the murder of my 2-year-old daughter, Brooklyn. In 2018, the Georgia Division of Family and Children Services, better known as DFACS, utterly failed to honor its responsibility to me and my daughter. My life will never be the same. Nothing can bring back my beautiful, sweet, and innocent Brooklyn. But I hope that my testimony can save another child's life and prevent families from having to go through what I experienced. That is why I took the first plane trip of my life to address the subcommittee. DFACS is supposed to protect children like Brooklyn. Instead, they violated my rights as her mother. They placed her in an unsafe home against my wishes, setting off a chain of events that led to her murder. The woman who killed my daughter is now serving a life sentence without parole. It took years to expose the problems that led to the preventable death of my child. Here's how the system failed Brooklyn and me. Before DFACS got involved, I had sole uncontested custody of Brooklyn. On January the 14th, 2018, Brooklyn was removed from my care. That happened when I was wrongfully arrested and detained in jail for a week. The police called DFACS to the scene of arrest. DFACS was supposed to make sure Brooklyn was in a safe home while I was in jail.
Take your time, Miss Aldridge.
I promised myself I wasn't going to cry. Okay. I had already arranged for my sister, a registered nurse, and brother-in-law, a federal law enforcement agent, to take Brooklyn on the day of my arrest. They knew Brooklyn and are very close family members. She adored them. They were also certified foster parents. DFACS refused to honor my wishes and rejected them as responsible caregivers for Brooklyn. Instead, DFACS placed her in the home of her father. He was not actively involved in her life. He was not legally recognized as her father and is not a certified foster care parent. More importantly, he did not have custody of Brooklyn. I was released from jail days later, and my first stop was to Brooklyn's father's home to pick up my daughter. I was so worried about her because she had never spent the night away from me. Brooklyn was very excited to see me, and I expected to take her home, but I didn't. But her father told me no and showed me paperwork that I later learned was a forged DFACS safety plan. The forgery said that if I took Brooklyn, he had to call law enforcement. I felt I had no choice and left Brooklyn at his home. I was distraught when I left her that night. Brooklyn's father had a live-in girlfriend who cared for Brooklyn while he was at work. I was very worried about that because I believed his girlfriend was using methamphetamine. I saw her messages to drug dealers. Since Brooklyn's father often worked overtime shifts, I was very concerned about leaving her alone with his girlfriend. The next day, I spoke to a DFACS supervisor. She told me Brooklyn's father had temporary custody of her. I shared my concerns with the supervisor about his live-in girlfriend caring for my daughter and the signs of meth use in the home. I begged the DFACS supervisor to move Brooklyn to my sister and brother-in-law's house where she would be safe. The supervisor ignored my pleas. Brooklyn stayed at her father's house for another agonizing 6 weeks, and there was nothing I could do about it. Brooklyn died on March 6, 2018. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the back of the head. and the girlfriend was convicted of murder in Brooklyn. Jesus Christ. I filed a wrongful death lawsuit against DFAC's caseworkers, and my complaint alleged DFACs did not take immediate action after I repeatedly told them about my concerns about Amanda Coleman's suspected drug use. The system meant to protect children failed Brooklyn at every level, from management down to the caseworker repeatedly. They failed to follow the policies meant to keep my child safe and violated our rights. Brooklyn's death cannot be in vain. I am here today to seek change. The child welfare system is supposed to protect families, not destroy them. Brooklyn would still be alive if anyone at DFACS had just been willing to listen to me, her own mother. We need better oversight of the system to ensure the safety of all Georgia families. I am grateful for the support I've received. I am grateful to my attorney, Brent Savage, for all the work he has done. Senators, you can stop this from happening again. You have the power to change the system. Please remember Brooklyn. Thank you.
Ms. Aldridge, thank you on behalf of the whole subcommittee for your courageous testimony and for sharing your story with us. And Ms. Houston, when you're ready, it's your turn now to deliver your opening statement.
Chairman Ossoff, Ranking Member Blackburn, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Monet Houston. I am 19 years old, and I am here today to share my experience as a former foster youth in DFACS system in Georgia. I was in care from 2017 to 2022. During that time, I had 18 placements. Only 2 were foster homes. The rest were group homes, institutions, or hotels. I had 3 case managers. Only 1 regularly visited me and answered my phone calls. I would often go more than 6 months without seeing my caseworker. I felt alone. One of the worst parts about being in care is that I was over-medicated. DFACS kept telling my doctors to up my dosage because I was not behaving. I was over-medicated to the point of feeling overtired and sluggish. It hurt to walk, but I had trauma and no one to talk about it with. The only time I regularly saw a therapist was when I was in Devereaux Advanced Behavioral Health for 10 months. Devereaux was a maximum security residential treatment program. I was in a behavioral program similar to a group home but with more security. It was a lockdown facility. It had 2 barbed wire fences. You never left the campus, not for school, outings, or food. I only left for doctor's appointments. During this time, I was often physically restrained. They slammed me into walls and put my arms into locks. They would wrap their legs around me so I couldn't move. At 3 different times, I was put into isolation for more than 5 days. The isolation room was similar to a jail cell, and I was treated as an inmate. You had to request access to the bathroom. I wasn't allowed to shower. Even when my menstrual cycle, I couldn't wash or change for 3 days. This was the darkest time in a placement. Education was challenging while I was in care. Because I was moving placements so much, the only education I would get would be online. I asked my case managers and my placements for a tutor because I struggled with understanding. But no one would listen. Eventually, I just gave up. I still haven't completed my GED. My most traumatic experience was when I was arrested at 17. The group home showed the police a video that didn't include me getting attacked first. Staff didn't de-escalate the situation. On September 7th, I was taken to jail from September 7th to November 8th in Americus, Georgia. When I was in jail, I was scared and alone, and I didn't know anything about what was going to happen. My caseworker never called me. This was my first time ever getting in trouble. No one from DFACS bought me any medications that I was on, which resulted in significant depression. I'm sorry. After a month in jail, the sheriff was trying to help me get out for my 18th birthday, which is October 26th. They said I could be released on a $200 bail. DFACS refused to pay my bail. I could only be released to DFACS custody. I was at DFACS's mercy, and they left me there for another month. The sheriff finally offered an OR bond, and on November 8th, I was released to DFACS custody. They picked me up and put me in a hotel for 2 weeks. The hotel was my last placement. I thought my case manager was finally coming to see me, but she sent somebody else instead, like always. This person told me to sign a bunch of papers. I was so angry that my caseworker didn't show up that I just signed the papers. I was furious. If I knew what the papers said, I would have never signed them. The person said to me, "You just signed yourself out of care. You need to be checked out of the hotel by 11 a.m., and we are not responsible to help you get back to Savannah once you sign out." My attorney and counsel was not present. They were unaware of the papers being presented to me. They left me at the hotel in Columbus, Georgia. If it wasn't for one kind behavior aid, I would have never knew how to get back to Savannah. I'm doing this so other youth know that they can come out on the other side. I was 17 when I was finally assigned a court-appointed specialist advocate, CASA. Ms. Page was the first adult who listened to me. She would regularly fight with DFACS to get me what I needed. I had one good case manager who showed she cared about me and listened to me, and now I'm connected with Brightside Advocacy, which supports me and provides me with hope.
Ms. Houston,
Yes, ma'am.
did you say your birthday is tomorrow?
Yes, ma'am.
Well, I think that calls for a big happy birthday. Everybody in.
Oh, my God. Thank you.
Bet you didn't know that was coming. Thank you both for your powerful personal testimonies and for sharing these stories with the Senate and with the public to help the public understand that we're talking about human beings. We're talking about real families. We're talking about real youth who move through the system. Ms. Aldridge, my daughter is about to turn 2 in December, the same age as Brooklyn when she was murdered. And so as a father, I want to thank you for sharing Brooklyn's story with us today. And I know there are no words that can describe the pain. And I'm so sorry for everything that you and Brooklyn have been through.
Thank you.
I am entering into the record a motion for pretrial summary judgment that was filed in Ms. Aldridge's wrongful death lawsuit against the DFACS caseworkers who handled Brooklyn's case. Now, Ms. Aldridge, DFACS placed your daughter in the care of her father, Mr. Lott, and his girlfriend, Ms. Coleman. But you were still Brooklyn's custodial parent, and you had the right to object to that placement. Did DFACS ever tell you that?
No, sir.
If you had known that DFACS needed your consent, would you have agreed to let Brooklyn stay with Mr. Lott and Ms. Coleman?
Definitely not. I would have took my daughter home. She had never been away from me before, ever. Never.
And you knew that or suspected that Ms. Coleman was dangerous, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
DFACS had a policy requiring it to run background checks on people who take care of children. But DFACS didn't run that background check, did they?
No, sir.
And if they had run a background check, they would have found that Ms. Coleman had a criminal history and that DFACS had previously pursued a child neglect case against her, correct?
Yes, sir.
Ms. Aldridge, court records show that when you visited Brooklyn you noticed there was a bruise on her leg. Did you report that bruise to DFACS?
I did.
But even after you reported that bruise, DFACS kept Brooklyn with Ms. Coleman, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
How did that make you feel?
Helpless. All I wanted to do was take my daughter home, and I couldn't. That's it. I just wanted my baby.
And Ms. Aldridge, your daughter Brooklyn was then killed from blunt force trauma to her head, and Ms. Coleman was convicted of her murder, correct?
Yes, sir.
Court records show that after Brooklyn was murdered, you received a Facebook message from Brooklyn's caseworker, Ms. Beaumier, who wrote to you, quote, "You did not fail her, DFACS did." How did you feel when you received that message?
Like it was too late. I mean, my daughter was already dead. There was nothing. I just felt helpless. Like the system that was put in place to protect my daughter failed her.
If DFACS had followed its own policies, had sought your consent for this placement, had run the background check that they were required to run, had listened to you when you reported that you had seen bruising on your daughter's body, do you believe Brooklyn would still be alive today?
Yes, sir.
Ms. Aldridge, you've been through every parent's absolute worst nightmare. And I'm sorry. And I think all of us are grateful that you've taken the time and summoned the courage to relive this and to share it with the public and the Senate. Why have you chosen today to take that step?
So what happened to Brooklyn doesn't happen to anybody else.
Thank you, Ms. Aldridge. I'll yield to Ranking Member Blackburn for her questions.
Okay.
Yes, thank you so much. Monet, I want to come to you. When we look at having caseworkers that are appropriate for the job
Yes, ma'am.
and that are going to have that duty of care to the children that they're responsible for, what I'd love to have from you for the record is talk to me about what a caseworker should do. If you had had a perfect caseworker, how would they have worked with you, encouraged you, listened to you, helped provide and protect you?
Well, nobody's perfect, but they didn't do their job. They were supposed to see me every month in person. They never saw me every month in person. Maybe if she would have came to my group home where I was at and saw me in person, she could have thought about moving me, but she never came to see me. They're supposed to let me go to my court.
Let me pop in right there.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this was over how many years?
5.
Over 5 years. Okay. So she should have seen you once a month for 5 years. And you said in your testimony about once every 6 months she would hear from them.
She's supposed to see us in person every month.
Right. Okay. Good.
And I had 3 caseworkers. Only one of them actually did their job. She came all the way 5 hours away to the lockdown facility to see me. Nobody's perfect, but they didn't listen. And when I acted out was the only time that they would ever answer their phone. If I was like when I had gotten into an accident, they did not answer the phone. But when it was time for me to leave that placement, that's when they would answer. They didn't answer at the times that they should, only when it was time to move my placement.
So if you were talking to Children's Services and you were writing the job description for somebody that is going to be a caseworker, what would you put in that job description to meet young girls like you? What would you want to see them do on a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly basis?
Well, listen to the children.
Okay.
I'll need them to check in with them as they should every month. Make sure that their placement is comfortable for them. Don't just stick them somewhere and not answer the phone for them no more. Don't just tell them the only reason you're on meds is because you don't behave. Like, make them feel love. Make them feel like they have a family in care at least.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Ms. Aldridge, as I read your testimony, I thought about parental rights and parents having rights. And as you have been through such a terrible ordeal, and I know it's something that your heart grieves every single day. And you said that you were doing this because you don't want other moms to have to live through what you've lived through. So now looking back on your ordeal, what would be the steps you would encourage other women who find themselves in the situation where you were? What would you say, here's a way to preserve your parental rights?
Get an attorney. I would definitely say an attorney is know your rights. I guess study about it. I don't have no idea. I would definitely say having an attorney. Having an attorney would, I don't know, you would have understood what your rights were. I mean, you can go with your gut, but just having an attorney, that's a big thing, I think, having an attorney.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blackburn. Senator Welch.
Well, thank you. By the way, not that I've been in the Senate that long, but that was the best happy birthday ever. Thank you. She's from Nashville, you can tell. But first of all, it's really moving for all of us to be here with you and to have you tell us what you've been through. So I want to thank you, and we all do, and it really matters. You know, so much of our time here is spent on things that seem a little bit abstract. To have two people who've experienced a very searing situation come in and share it has a powerful impact. And I know the chairman and the ranking member and Senator Butler and I want to do all we can to help improve the situation. You know, my questions have been asked largely because I'll just give you each a chance to just describe what you think would improve the situation. I mean, you said, Ms. Aldridge, having a lawyer would really make a difference. I know that's true. I was a public defender, and I was involved in many cases involving parental rights. And the state of Vermont made certain that everyone was represented, the parents and the child, and it forced people to take things very seriously and not just wave it off. So I think that's a really, really good recommendation. I thank you for that. And Ms. Houston, thank you. You seem to be doing pretty good.
No, that is Kate is here.
Well, that's great, but it's amazing. What you said earlier is you're here so that other people who went through what you did can see that they can get to the other side, and I think you're really demonstrating that. You know, when you were asked about a good system, what I heard you saying basically is the people who were supposed to be like your caseworkers have to take this situation and the relationship seriously, that you were isolated and alone, and not just when you were put in isolation, but the whole time, whatever it is you were going through, you had nobody to help you along the way. Is that more or less a correct
Yes, sir.
assessment? Yeah, and by the way, you know, all of us need a little help along the way. especially when we're in a situation that's totally alien. But you told me you had 19 placements in
18.
18 in foster care. So how long would you be there before you were gone somewhere else?
4 months.
So minimal sustained relationships with a parental figure or even with friends, I imagine.
I never had friends.
Right. So you were bouncing from school to school and never had an opportunity to have your feet solidly on the ground. Yeah, I mean, that's just really, really shocking. You have no chance with that.
It got to a point where I was self-harm because I didn't know nobody to talk to.
Right. Well, it's really shocking. It's inexcusable, and I think all of us are very, very sad that was so much a part of your life so far. But I think it's inspiring to see you here being strong. And Ms. Aldridge, the same thing. I'm just, we're parents, and you suffered the loss that all of us feel the most. And thank you for being here to try to help other people out. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Welch. Senator Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership on this issue. Having a conversation with such courageous women like Ms. Aldridge and Ms. Houston really is an honor for us. And we owe you a debt of gratitude for organizing such a thoughtful hearing and set of witnesses and conversation. I have a 9-year-old daughter who is adopted. My family and I went through the certification process in California, in Los Angeles County, to become certified foster parents. That wound up not being our final path, but I experienced the other side of the system and the deficiencies that exist, the gaps, the imperfect but hardworking people in most instances who try their best to get it right. Ms. Houston, I'd like to start with you, if it's okay. I just want to appreciate so much you coming and sharing your story, and I couldn't help but notice you being so moved by Ms. Aldridge's story. And that level of empathy and human connection, I just wanted to recognize for the record. The world would tell us that we are all so different.
That's me all the time.
Right? And to see you, to see your heart be pained by another human's tragedy, I think is just an example and a reminder that there is more that binds us, even in the painful times, than that divides us. It was an interesting to hear you talk about your treatment as care. You talked about the care that you received as has been sort of interrogated or questioned a little bit by my colleagues. I think the fact that you refer to it as care says so much about who you are. Here's my question to you. There was a moment in your testimony when you referred to an individual whose intervention seemed as if it had a positive impact on you. And I want to give some breath and offer you the opportunity to give a little bit about that CASA worker who was assigned to you, who made your soul smile. And talk to us about that experience and how that helped to support you to get to this moment.
Okay, right before I went to jail, like maybe 3 months before, I met Miss Page. Miss Kate assigned her to me. And when she came all the way from Savannah to see me, I did not want to talk to her. Like, I was shooing her away. I was like, just go away. Like, just go back to Savannah. I'm okay. and she would not give up on me. Like, she kept prying her way in until she got in, and then eventually I got out of care because of the situation. I signed the papers on accident, and she still was there for me. She did not let me sleep outside. Like, she reached out to CASA program, and she worked like hard with them to get me somewhere to be. Like, they even got me back in care, and the foster system did not want me back, and they still made it happen. So I just want to thank Miss Page, and she's still here in my life. She takes my phone, cheering me on right now. I thank her a lot.
I think we all thank Miss Page. There are lots of Miss Pages in the world, as many as there are who let you down. There are some Miss Pages out there, and we're grateful for it. You were going to offer something additional.
It's crazy because a lot of people that I try to push away, they actually leave, but she didn't.
Yeah. There are a lot of Miss Pages. In my life, her name was Miss Pearl. So we all have a Miss Page or Miss Pearl. Just quickly before I run out of time, Miss Aldridge, as a parent, I couldn't imagine the pains of what you went through. I remember my daughter turned 2, and she just turned 9. And thinking about her life being cut short, I just could not imagine it. So I want to appreciate your courage for sharing your story, for not swallowing what others would have us to believe as personal shame, but for giving voice to young Brooklyn. I would just ask you, you said a lot about, like, the reason you being here is to prevent this kind of harm and tragedy for other Brooklyns that might be in the system, and I think for other Miss Aldridges who might be in the system as well. Do you think that there's something unique about your experience in Georgia, or are there other parents and or children that you know? Is there something that we should be paying attention to that that families might have in common? Where we can think across the system and across the states to try to answer the call that you put before this subcommittee to act and save other families?
Mm-hmm. I don't know. I have no idea. Can you, like...
Yeah, I guess... Without knowing any details, and only hearing your testimony and reading your written testimony, I guess I wonder, are there other people that you might know in the Georgia system that had similar negative experiences?
I mean, personally, I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyone else? No, ma'am.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate it, and most of all, I appreciate you being here and giving voice to parents and to young people. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Butler. And before we move to the next panel, Ms. Houston, just going to ask you a few more questions just to make sure the record reflects what you've experienced and what you need the public to understand about what you've experienced based upon your opening statement. You described being over-medicated while in a maximum security facility. Tell us what that means. How did it feel?
I was over-medicated the whole time, the whole 5 years. I felt like sluggish, like I couldn't move, and it started affecting my physical. I started eating a lot, and one time I went to court and my judge even said she's on too many meds. Somebody has to take her off some of these meds or lower the dosages. The next day after court, I went back to my psychiatrist and they upped my dosages. So, and I feel like it made me worse rather than better because they only put me on the medicines to make me behave. Instead of putting me on meds to help my mental health, they just wanted me to sit down and behave for them. And they never talked to me about what was wrong. They never asked me any questions. They just said, she doesn't behave. and she needs meds. So I felt, and I also, as I kept eating, it gave me high cholesterol. I was pre-diabetic, and I kept telling my psychiatrist, like, is there any meds that does not have this hunger effect, this appetite effect? And they did not take me off of the meds. My DFACS caseworker was telling my psychiatrist that I needed those meds, that I don't behave, that I need those meds to behave.
So it sounds like the impression you got, and indeed what they may have said at the time, despite what a judge had said, was that this wasn't about your mental health, it was about controlling your behavior.
Yes, sir.
Did I hear correctly that at one of your placements you were slammed against the floor or the
Yes,
wall
at the lockdown facility.
and placed in solitary confinement for up to 5
Yes,
days
sir.
at a time? And were you threatened with solitary confinement as a punishment?
Yes.
You mentioned this in your opening remarks in your exchange with Senator Blackburn, that DFACS has a policy requiring your caseworker to visit you monthly, and that at one time you were in jail while you were in foster care, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you were kept there for about 2 months?
Yes, sir.
And after 1 month, you were cleared to be released, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And why weren't you released at that point?
Because DFACS told me that they didn't want to be responsible for me getting back to court. Or because when you sign a bond, you're responsible for that person. Like, if I don't show up to court, they could get in trouble. So they didn't want to be responsible for that,
So the jail was prepared to release you, but DFACS wouldn't come pick you up?
basically.
Ms. Houston, I want to echo what Senator Butler said, and thank you for your courage and also for your spirit. I can tell you, we hold a lot of these hearings. We speak to a lot of folks, and the warmth and compassion and kindness that you radiate, I think, has lifted all of us up, particularly in light of the tremendously difficult circumstances that you're describing. And to see you here not just persevering and surviving, but in fact using your voice to fight for other youth who are going through the same thing and to make a difference has inspired all of us. So thank you, Ms. Houston.
Thank you.
Ms. Aldridge, for your courageous testimony. We are going to now take a brief recess so that members can go and vote. We have a vote on the floor. We will then return and reconvene with panel 2. And so the subcommittee stands in recess. The subcommittee will return to order. I will now introduce our second panel of witnesses. Thank you again for joining us today. Professor Melissa Carter is the Executive Director of the Barton Child Law and Policy Center at Emory Law School. Professor Carter and her clinic promote and protect the legal rights and interests of abused, neglected, and court-involved children in Georgia. She also serves in a variety of capacities across the state as a member of the First Lady's Children's Cabinet, Vice Chair of the Juvenile Justice State Advisory Group, and co-chair of the Children's Justice Act Task Force, a congressionally mandated oversight panel. Professor Emra Hetherington is the director of the Wilbanks Child Endangerment and Sexual Exploitation Clinic at the University of Georgia School of Law. Professor Hetherington and her clinic represent children in foster care who survive sexual abuse, exploitation, and trafficking. She also serves on several statewide task forces and multidisciplinary teams, including the Supreme Court of Georgia's Committee on Justice for Children. Once again, it is the practice of the subcommittee to swear in our witnesses. If you will both please rise and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give before the subcommittee is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Please take your seats. Professor Carter, when you are ready, we will begin with your opening statement. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Chairman Ossoff, Ranking Member Blackburn, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Melissa Carter. I'm a clinical professor of law at Emory Law School in Atlanta, Georgia. Thank you for inviting me here to talk about this important topic today. I'm doing so in my personal capacity. The views I express are my own and do not necessarily represent my employer or any board, commission, task force, or other body on which I serve. My comments do, however, represent more than 20 years as a child welfare professional in Georgia, serving in direct representation and system improvement roles. At Emory Law School, for the past 13 years, I have led the Barton Child Law and Policy Center. The Barton Center is where law students and other graduate students come to learn how to protect children's rights through litigation and policy advocacy strategies. Today, I'm going to talk about Georgia's child welfare system to try to provide some context for what we've heard today. First, I want to start with some hard data to paint a picture of the basic hydraulics of the system. And then I want to highlight just two systemic conditions that perpetuate the status quo in Georgia. And to be clear, the status quo is unacceptable. First, let me start with some basic facts and figures. As we sit here today, approximately 11,000 children are in foster care in Georgia, and that number is trending up. Our removal rate is relatively low. Children in Georgia enter foster care at the rate of 1.9 per 1,000, compared with the national entry rate, which hovers closer to 3 to 4 per 1,000. Foster care is meant to be temporary. What that means in Georgia is that children spend on average 19 months separated from their families once they are in foster care. That's longer than the nation's median length of stay, which has increased over the last decade and is now around 17 and a half months. This profile makes Georgia seem somewhat unremarkable from a data perspective, but this data doesn't tell the whole story. Behind those numbers are real whole people, as you all have recognized. The data doesn't give us that up-close understanding of how the system impacts their lives, like the heartbreaking testimonials we've heard today. Those stories are difficult to take in, but they are not outliers. The child welfare system is complex. There are multiple failure points. All jurisdictions confront similar challenges to a greater or lesser extent, but local context matters. A lot of this, as we've heard already today, it can be summed up quickly in thinking about two aspects of our system that we could improve. One, we don't give case managers the tools that they need, and two, we don't listen well enough to children and families. But I also want to highlight two systemic conditions that illustrate how we also don't manage our system well. One affects safety. Georgia cannot reliably measure or monitor child victimization. Whether a child is subjected to maltreatment is determined by the substantiation of alleged maltreatment. That's the practice of looking at all of the evidence gathered during an investigation and determining whether that evidence suggests that it is more likely than not that the abuse or neglect occurred. We've lost our bottom line metric for success in our primary mission, child safety, because we don't reliably make that determination. And without it, we have less confidence in conclusions about how effective the agency is when it intervenes in families. The other condition at the system level is one that affects family integrity. Georgia has not sufficiently invested in prevention, nor have federal funds been well spent. For instance, as you know, one goal of the Federal Temporary Assistance for Needy Families Block Grant is to provide assistance to low-income families so that children can be cared for in their own homes. It gives Georgia certain discretion how to do that. Georgia could spend the money in direct support to families and prevent children from entering foster care, but instead, Georgia is content to withhold the money from families and use it to pay for services only after a child suffers harm. These spending choices may keep us compliant with federal requirements, but they impede our ability to transform our child welfare system into one that promotes children's healthy development through prevention and family strengthening. This is not about individual shortcomings. There are many dedicated case managers, supervisors, and others at the front line working tirelessly to solve problems for families. This is about systemic failures. Georgia lacks the operational capacity, policy infrastructure, and practice tools to support effective case management and to offer meaningful and sustainable solutions for children, youth, and families. I hope this provides you with some context for deeper understanding of the system realities as they relate to the outcomes we seek. I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Carter. And Professor Hetherington, it's now your turn for your opening statement.
Chairman Ossoff, Ranking Member Blackburn, members of the Senate Subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Emma Hetherington, and I'm a clinical associate professor at the University of Georgia School of Law and director of the Wilbanks Cease Clinic, as mentioned by Senator Ossoff. Like Professor Carter, the views I express today are my own and do not represent the views of the University of Georgia, the School of Law, or the various subcommittees and task forces on which I have the privilege to serve. Rather, today I'm testifying in my personal capacity as an attorney, expert in child welfare law, and advocate for children in foster care who have been sexually abused, exploited, and trafficked. Over the past 12 years working in this field, I have witnessed a system that fails on a daily basis to protect the well-being, health, and safety of children, and instead violates their civil and human rights. The foster care system in Georgia has always struggled with systemic challenges and barriers, but I have never seen it as dismal as it is today. Here's a snapshot of 35 of our clients and their experiences in foster care in counties across Georgia. 100% of our clients experienced early childhood maltreatment. 74% of our clients have made credible allegations of abuse or neglect at the hands of their foster care placement caregivers. Only 17% of our clients are on track to graduate from high school with their peers. Only 5% of our clients who have exited foster care are now better off than when they entered. 0% of our clients have received adequate, timely, and consistent medical, dental, and mental and behavioral health care while they've been in the custody of Georgia DFACS. As Professor Carter mentioned, I, as well, would like to be clear that my statement is not meant to disparage the individual case managers and other professionals working for Georgia DFACS who are protecting children in Georgia. However, DFACS's overarching structure, internal policies, and administrative barriers obstruct their good work. And when this happens, our clients experience extreme harm. The following are examples of some of the abuse and neglect that my clients have experienced while in DFACS's legal custody. In listening to Ms. Houston's testimony, they sound very similar. Being placed in solitary confinement with no therapeutic oversight after a suicide attempt. Being handcuffed during an intravaginal ultrasound to confirm pregnancy after being trafficked. Having chronic urinary tract infections and leftover pieces of placenta after childbirth which can be deadly, but not being provided access to postpartum medical care. Being prohibited from going to school in person by a placement that was approved by DFACS specifically for trafficking victims in order to protect other students and school employees from their promiscuity. Having their pants forcibly pulled down and being administered a sedative in their buttocks because they talked back to staff. Calling DFACS case managers during emergencies and not receiving any response, leading to acute psychiatric hospitalizations and, at times, sexual exploitation. While my clients may not have suffered these acts of abuse and neglect at the hands of DFACS employees, DFACS knew about this treatment, and they did nothing to stop it or remedy it. Instead, they have blamed my clients for their fear, anger, and victimization. Here are some words that we have seen in internal and external DFACS documents and heard in conversations with DFACS employees about our clients. They're promiscuous, hypersexualized, they're a sex addict, they're a prostitute. Let me make it clear, there is no such thing as a child prostitute. In conclusion, I would like to share some words with you from one of my clients who gave me permission to share some of her experiences with you today. I am a victim of Georgia DFACS. Children go into the system to be in a safer environment, to grow and to learn. However, the way my case has been handled these past 3 years has caused me further pain and trauma, and worse off than before I entered care. I've experienced a lot, from abuse to neglect to commercial and sexual exploitation. I've put my life in jeopardy and placed myself in dangerous situations in an attempt to leave DFACS's care, the care that has failed to provide me with adequate or any medical, dental, or mental health care. In my mind, getting out of DFACS has always been the goal, and at times I didn't care if I ended up dead trying to leave. Thank you, and I welcome any questions the committee may have.
Well, Professors Hetherington and Carter, thank you for your powerful opening statements. And Professor Hetherington, I'd like to begin with some questions for you to elaborate on the alarming and shocking testimony that you just presented. How many children have you worked with over the years, Professor Hetherington, who have been sexually abused, exploited, or trafficked?
It's essentially impossible to really know. We know that children are not highly likely to disclose abuse, especially when they are in situations where they do not feel safe, which includes in the custody of Georgia DFACS. I have represented hundreds of children over the last 12 years, most of whom have been older youth, ages 14 and up, and many of whom have been sexually abused and trafficked. Currently at the CEASE clinic, all of our clients, every single one of them, have been sexually abused or trafficked, most of the time since an early age. So I wish I had a number for you, an exact number for you, but unless we listen to children when they disclose acts of abuse or indicate red flags that would demonstrate abuse, sexual abuse and exploitation, we will never know how many there actually are.
You described an incident in your testimony, Professor Hetherington, where one of your clients was handcuffed while receiving a transvaginal ultrasound after having been trafficked. What is the effect of that kind of treatment on someone who is in care?
Sure.
Or any human being?
Well, first of all, for that client, it was a clear violation of her human rights, her dignity, her personhood. She was 16 years old. It's obviously re-traumatizing. I can never know the full effect. My clients are the experts on their own experiences. But the effect of her life today is that that particular client is currently homeless. That child, the child she had was taken out of her care, is thankfully being cared for by relatives. And she is, to my knowledge, still being trafficked now as an adult. And those are the consequences that we see on a daily basis in our cases.
You described an incident, Professor Hetherington, in which a client struggled to get postpartum medical care leading to infections? Do your clients, and by the way, we're using the term clients, and these are your clients, but I just want to remind everybody that we're talking about children, youth, minors. We're talking about children. We're talking about children being subjected to degrading and abusive medical procedures. We're talking about children being denied postpartum medical care. Professor Hetherington, do your clients receive health care? Your clients, these children, do they receive health care from DFACS?
They receive some health care, is probably the easiest answer. But first, I just want to say thank you for recognizing that when I say clients, it's because I'm used to it as an attorney. But my clients are children, and that is something that we are constantly fighting to remind DFACS of. They are treated, they're adultified, they are treated as if they traumatize themselves. And so thank you for that acknowledgement.
Let's unpick that a little bit, because I think that's a powerful thing that you just said. Is there a recognition within this bureaucracy that we're talking about the most vulnerable children in our society? I mean, describe what you mean by adultified.
Sure. So often children in foster care, particularly Black and brown girls and LGBTQ youth, are treated more like adults. They are not treated as children. They are treated as if they are responsible. I'll give you an example. I represented a child who was 15 years old. She was a mother. DFACS removed her child from her care. That happens very often when children are in foster care. And one of the reasons that DFACS listed for why the child was in foster care was because my client did not have stable housing. My child client was 15. She didn't have stable housing because her parents abandoned her, because she had been sexually abused since a young age. She was effectively homeless, and she was being held responsible for that homelessness and not having that stable housing. But she was 15. And that is an example of how they would adultify a child.
You mentioned that one of your clients, again a child, had been prohibited from attending school in person. And if I heard you correctly, and I did a double take when you said this, I think what you said is that your child was forbidden from, your child client was forbidden from attending school because the state deemed that child sexually promiscuous. Is that what you said?
Yes. In that case, and in many instances, children who are victims of commercial and sexual exploitation are deemed to be either a run risk or too promiscuous. They're going to cause too many problems in school. And that there are some group homes in Georgia that will not allow children who have been trafficked to go to school off campus. And it's a denial of the recognition that every child is unique and different, and that we have a federal mandate that children be placed in the most family-like, least restrictive setting, and not every child who's been trafficked needs to be in lockdown. And in fact, they feel very unsafe in lockdown quite often. But yes, that is exactly what I said. They were worried that they would prey on other people.
I will come back with some additional questions. I want to be respectful of Senator Blackburn's time. So Ranking Member Blackburn, over to you.
Thank you so much. Professor Carter, what is the process that the state of Georgia uses to vet the sponsors and the foster parents?
So with respect to foster parents,
You'll need to turn on your microphone.
Yeah.
forgive me, thank you. So with respect to foster parents, there is a process. In most states, it's a licensure process. In Georgia, it's an approval process, but that process still follows the same steps. That involves a background check. It involves requirements for training, and then you are then able to select for the state, to identify for the state which children you want to open your home to. So if you think that you might be best equipped to take teenagers, if you think you might be best equipped to take large sibling groups, you think you might be best equipped to take an infant, you can make those preferences known. And then it's a matter of waiting for the state to need your home as a placement for a child who's entered foster care.
Okay, and we've heard a lot about the adverse experiences in Georgia. So what percentage of children in the system have an adverse experience?
So I think you're referring to the adverse childhood experiences context, where we really think about this sort of broad array of experiences that we may all have as children that then manifest later as adults in ways that stunt our development and that cause us even physical health conditions as we age. I'm not aware of a study that's looked at Georgia specifically to know that. We know, generally speaking, that children in foster care, as you might expect, have suffered much greater adversity in their young lives, and that children in foster care very often have 4 or more ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and therefore would expect to have much greater challenges across their life.
Yes, I am sure of that. Tennessee has been successful in a program with the ACEs, and Children's Services has a Building Strong Brains initiative that they have launched, and recently I introduced the National Assert Grant Program Authorization Act. This is something Senator Shaheen and I are doing to nationalize this and to make certain that every state has the tools that they need. So, Ms. Hetherington, I want to come to you on this. If you could speak for a moment about the importance of having that early childhood intervention for children that have had this trauma.
Sure. And excuse me, Senator Blackburn, I just wanted to thank you for highlighting the issue of trafficking. And when you mentioned the pipeline between foster care and sex trafficking, there is a abuse to prison pipeline that we see, often referred to as foster care to prison pipeline, or the sexual abuse to prison pipeline. Early childhood maltreatment alters a child's neurological, biological, developmental health, their growth. A wonderful resource on that, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend you read the book, The Body Keeps the Score. And one thing that we know from research is that when a child or when a person experiences extreme traumas, often we're stuck in that trauma. I'm not a neurologist, I'm not a neurobiologist, but I do know from the research that I've done and the work that I've done with children and anecdotally that it's true that children will become stuck at the age, right, where they were abused and neglected. So if a child is sexually abused at age...
Let's clarify that for the record. Their maturity stops.
Yes.
If you want to...
A lot of the social, emotional development. Right. Yes, thank you. Absolutely. And so I always think of it as most of my clients, not all of my clients, but many of my clients, they may be 16 and you have a 16-year-old standing in front of you, but socially, emotionally, they're still 6 years old.
Yeah.
That's the age when they were first sexually abused. And it sends them on a straight path towards eventual behavioral issues, health issues. Monet mentioned prediabetes. Prediabetes is a terrible side effect, for lack of a better way of putting it, of early childhood maltreatment. If you think about it, they are having this constant rush of cortisol through their bodies. They're in constant fight, flight, or freeze mode. And so if we do not provide that early childhood intervention and care, then we are sending children down that pipeline.
You know, we had a hearing on unaccompanied alien children in Judiciary Committee, a full committee hearing earlier this morning, and a lot of it centered on the 85,000 children that HHS and the Office of Refugee Resettlement cannot find. And they are children that have come into the country. They've been placed in foster care or with sponsors. The 1 month follow-up call was given. They couldn't find the sponsor, and they don't know the condition of these children. And the fear is, and what we have learned from some New York Times reporting and other things, is that these children are in labor gangs and crews, and some of them are being trafficked. And it just is heartbreaking to me, absolutely heartbreaking, that we have a federal agency that has so failed these children and for what they're being exposed to, because as you're saying, this is something that many of them never get over.
Yes, absolutely, and this is something that we see often. Our office has represented several undocumented youth. Some have been victims of labor trafficking, and as I was mentioning before, when it comes to Georgia DFACS, what we will often see is maybe there was a phone call. This child's not in school. Why is this 15-year-old working full time? This 10-year-old is working on a farm. What is going on here? There's an allegation of sexual abuse. We don't know what's happened to them. We don't know what's going on. Oh, but they want to work, right? And all of a sudden they're adultified. Maybe they are in a situation where they're arrested trying to defend themselves against traffickers, and sometimes we've seen that some sponsors have been involved in that trafficking. And the system, though, the Georgia DFACS, the child welfare system, responds punitively. They do not always see those children as dependent, as having been abused or neglected. And I would imagine there are several in their care that are not getting what they need. One thing I think that is also very important to note is the importance of the training for caseworkers and other professionals at DFACS to understand special immigrant juvenile status, to understand when you need to refer children for potential immigration relief. Maybe they are eligible for a U visa or a T visa, specifically for trafficking victims, and they can get that relief. And we've also seen recently a lot of issues with Georgia DFACS where undocumented youth who are in their care, who do not have permanent status by the time they reach the age of 18, even if they've been in foster care for at least 6 months after the age of 14, they're kicked out the door and left homeless and told they cannot stay in care post-18, even though that is available to all of their children under similar circumstances.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for focusing on this issue, which is so deeply troubling. Human trafficking is a scourge everywhere, not only in the states where you work, but in Connecticut and elsewhere around the country. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act and its reauthorization really brought the full power of the federal government to bear, but it also established civil remedies. My understanding is that on average, only about 30 civil cases are filed in federal courts every year. My question is, why aren't there more? Is it a lack of representation? Is it fear or shame on the part of the trafficked victims? They are victims or survivors. What is your analysis?
Sure. So we at the Wilbanks Cease Clinic, our original mission was to represent survivors in civil lawsuits against perpetrators individually. I think one of the major issues that we see is that in our American tort system, and I know this is not a hearing on American torts, but is that typically lawyers will go after deep pockets. So an individual trafficker might not have those deep pockets. That would be one answer. Another is the lack of survivors coming forward. When we see survivors, particularly of adult sex trafficking, the estimates are that between 70 and 90% of them have been sexually abused at a younger age or trafficked at a younger age. And the majority of them had some sort of child welfare system involvement. And that is absolutely consistent with what we see. At the Cease Clinic, we also do some post-conviction relief work for victims of adult victims of trafficking. They were all sexually abused or trafficked as minors, and we hear from every single one of them. They were either in DFACS custody or had child welfare involvement in another state. When that happens and children are maltreated in care and the system that is supposed to protect them and help them and give them voice instead silences them, they're not going to come forward. They don't trust the system. They don't trust anyone to believe them when they say, I'm a victim of this. So I think there are a number of different reasons for it, but I think those are some of the main ones.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Professor Carter, in your opening statement, you talked about systemic failures in Georgia DFACS and Georgia's child welfare system. Can you elaborate on what that means for children in Georgia who are at risk of abuse or neglect?
I think that, excuse me, get this button right eventually. I think, really to take your lead, to follow your lead, and always ground our observations in the realities of the children and families and youth who are impacted. I think when we talk about systemic failings, we're looking at these conditions, right? These broad, removed structural and organizational features of our system. But the truth is we don't know about those things. They're sort of invisible and hidden until there's an impact that we can identify and point to. And those impacts come in the experiences of children and youth. So I would echo some of the examples that Professor Hetherington and even our earlier speakers provided, the kinds of themes that we are seeing that are indicative of systemic failures at the level of experience of children and youth involve, for example, undocumented youth with special immigrant juvenile status who have been left with their abusers because the department is unwilling to take them into custody and serve them through foster care, or children who become at the age of 18 eligible for what we would refer to as extended youth support services. This is the continuation of support for children, now young adults, beyond the age of majority, so that we're extending that safety net of support. And we see and hear regularly and routinely that these young adults now are denied the right to sign themselves back into care, or like Ms. Houston was describing in her own experience, they are encouraged, if not pushed, out of those support services because they might be difficult to serve, and difficult to serve often means expensive to serve. We hear about pretty consistently and routinely about children who have families who have open child protective services cases, and we're seeing what seems to be increasing number of reported fatalities of infants despite having the open child protective case. We have many persistent and historical challenges with youth who have been institutionalized in high-end residential settings or in juvenile detention facilities or adult jails and not been picked up upon their release, or conversely, children who are threatened with being committed to psychiatric treatment facilities or arrested for non-compliance with services. We have locally observations and reports around the department's outright disregard for court orders to prevent children from, that they're disregarding in order that children not enter care, or threats that are made to parents that they'll be charged with abandonment. We also have a lot of local departments just looking at the courts and at the judges and saying, this isn't us, right? Make this someone else's responsibility. Choose a different agency, characterize what's going on with this family in a different way. We also have consistent and persistent problems that really speak to a lack of support for caregivers, particularly relatives or what we refer to as fictive kin, people who aren't related by blood or legal relationship but take children in when they are known to those children, and a real lack of support once those folks step forward and take in children. We also have increasingly reports about children being placed out of county. So children who are taken into foster care, but because of a lack of placement resources, not kept in their home county, which of course impedes the ability for that child to have ongoing relationships and contact with their families, to be stable in school, to have some stability with their health care providers, et cetera. All of that is disrupted when children are relocated.
And I want to thank you, Professor, for giving us that kind of clarity and specificity about the kinds of cases you are seeing. As you know, this is an active and ongoing inquiry, and you have pointed us in the direction of additional areas of necessary investigation. Now, I want you to walk the subcommittee and the public through this internal audit process. So the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services reviews how well state foster care systems are performing, including Georgia's, as part of the Child and Family Services Review. Can you please just briefly describe the case review process that HHS undertakes as part of that process?
Yes, sure. So thank you for the question. As you describe it, the Child and Family Services Review is a periodic kind of federal audit of state foster care and family preservation programs. Every state undergoes this audit at different cycles. The review assesses the outcome of services by looking at some individual case review, as you describe it, along essentially 7 defined outcome areas. And then each of those outcome areas is further defined by measurements that are referred to as items. So you'll see items under outcomes, and the outcomes are meant to reflect the state's performance in these broad areas of safety, permanency, and well-being. And those 3 domains really define the outcomes that we are seeking from this system. As you describe it, the process in its entirety involves a lot of data collection. The state also undergoes its own self-assessment, but I think key to your question are these case record reviews, where a sample of cases, when the federal government conducts it, it's 65 cases, which are a mix of both foster care and family preservation cases. Those are cases where children are still at home with their parents, but the family's receiving mandated services. And through those 65 cases, again, the reviewers are looking across these 7 outcome areas for evidence to support these measurements in order to have an ultimate understanding of how the system is faring with respect to those outcomes of safety, permanency, and well-being.
Thank you. And the subcommittee has obtained Georgia DFAC's assessment of its performance on those same federal standards for a period of March to June of 2023. I'd like to go through DFAC's assessment with you. Please turn to tab 3 or slide 3, please turn to exhibit 2. This is Spring 2023 DFAC's audit, and I'm introducing this document into the record. And if we turn to slide 3 in the bottom row of the chart under item 3, we see that according to this internal Georgia DFAC's audit of its own performance, DFAC's found that it met risk assessment and safety management obligations only 16% of the time. So in other words, Georgia DFAC's, according to this self-audit, failed 84% of the time on risk assessment and safety management. Can you translate that for the public to understand what that means for children in Georgia?
I think it's important first to think about what we refer to as safety assessment. We have to think about here what's happening is that the state is intervening with family, right? As parents, we're allowed to direct our daily lives of our children without the government telling us how to do that. The threshold for government intervention is really a question of harm or risk of harm to the child. That's what invokes the state's responsibility, its duty to protect children. Once it does intervene in families, every decision, every action thereafter is calibrated around this assessment of the child's safety. So as a matter both of policy, like in every state, but certainly true here for Georgia DFACs, and a matter of best practice, there is an initial safety assessment that happens, and then there's an expectation that safety is assessed on an ongoing basis. And safety assessment is both an art and, I suppose, a technique, a formal skill. There are both formal and informal ways that safety assessment can happen. And so what we're looking at here in item 3, which is, again, in one of these broad domain areas of safety, is really looking at the adequacy of the response. So a report has been made to the department that says a child has been abused or neglected. The department then makes a response and conducts a safety assessment, and then throughout the continuing life of that case, the continuing involvement of the state in that family, the caseworkers are on an ongoing basis trying to collect information and make a determination about the existence of a danger to that child, a threat to the child, and how the ability of the parents, the competency, the parenting competencies and resources can mitigate against that threat. And this determines things like the track assignment. How much is DFACS going to be involved? Are you going to be investigated, or are you going to have some other level of lower concern response? Whether a child is going to be removed, whether a child will be returned home at some point, what is the appropriateness of any placement? So honestly, I can't think of a much better example than the one that we heard this morning with Ms. Aldridge. The idea of what's happened there is that a report would have been called in on the basis of her reported incarceration and unavailability as a parent. The department would approach that circumstance and investigate it, easy enough to verify. And then the department is going to, at that point, because there was no available parent, going to, as it did in that case, create what's called an out-of-home safety plan to figure out where that child is going to live and who's going to take care of her during the time that her parent is unavailable. And so they should have better assessed the options that were available for a substitute caregiver. And through the course of that assessment would be to check backgrounds, as you mentioned earlier, to get some additional information about the suitability of that alternate substitute caregiver. And then once the child is placed there, that there's this ongoing responsibility to be checking in, to just make contact with that child, with those caregivers, to continue to take in information, to adjust the sort of on the basis of changing circumstances. Is there someone new in the home? Right? In this case, does the father have a girlfriend that might be inappropriate? What has changed in the composition of the household? Where might there be a critical incident that needs a different response, et cetera?
And Professor Carter, to that point, in terms of conveying to the public, okay, what does it mean if, according to this DFACS audit, there's an 84% failure rate to properly assess and respond to risk and safety issues? What we also heard from Ms. Aldrich is that she reported observed bruising on the body of her then still living child to Georgia DFACS. But because no proper action was taken, the child remained in a dangerous living environment and was subsequently killed. There are a few statistics on this chart, Professor Carter, and one assesses whether DFACS timely initiates an investigation. And on that measure, the number is pretty good. But on risk assessment and safety management, it's an 84% failure rate. We heard today from Ms. Aldrich firsthand what that can mean for a child and for a family. Can you explain why the timely initiation of investigation is inadequate if the risk assessment and safety response are improperly undertaken?
Right, so thank you. So these are, again, two of the three items that are designed to measure safety and how well the agency, how effectively the agency is responding to a report of abuse or neglect. And the first item, as you describe it, is just the capture of the activity of responding. So once a call has come in, does then someone from DFACS go and make face-to-face contact with the child victim, the alleged child victim, within the prescribed timeframes? And in Georgia, there are 3 different levels of response. depending on the severity of the allegation. Immediately, within 24 hours or within 72 hours, a DFACS worker needs to make face-to-face contact with the child and conduct or initiate this initial safety assessment. Again, gathering of information to determine under the circumstances as they were known whether that child is safe or unsafe. The other item, item 3, which we've been discussing, is really, again, about the adequacy of the response. So what were the type of activities that were undertaken, not just the dispatching of a person to make contact, but the actual then use of clinical and other skills to make a judgment about what's going on and fashion a plan and services. And really just to put it kind of directly and simply, you ask what the implication of this is for children. The implication of poor performance on risk assessment and safety management is that children are unsafe, or at least that we can't be certain about their safety. And that being the primary mission of this agency, of this system, of the, and consistent with the duty of the state, shows a pretty complete failure.
And Professor Carter, you had mentioned that you serve, I believe, co-chair one of the 3 congressionally mandated citizen review panels whose purpose is to oversee Georgia DFACS. And without objection, I want to enter into the record Exhibit 3, which is the 2021 Citizen Review Panel Annual Report. What we find on page 15, Professor Carter, of this 2021 report is that this panel of outside experts mandated by Congress to oversee Georgia DFACS activities was writing at this time in 2021 about ongoing concern on the lack of significant progress, that's a direct quote, on this exact item, risk assessment and safety management. So here we have early 2023, an 84% failure rate to assess risk and respond to safety hazards for children. Again, this sounds like a lot of bureaucratic jargon. What it means is Brooklyn, when it is reported that there's bruising on her body, protected from the adult who is harming her? That's what's at stake here. And we see in the work of this citizen review panel back to at least 2021 explicitly raising concerns about Georgia's performance on risk assessment and safety management, correct?
That's correct. These oversight bodies were thought by Congress as a way to help bring in a community of perspective on the work and really help to illuminate these kinds of systemic deficiencies. So here, this body, which is impaneled by people who know the work, these are members of our broader child welfare community in Georgia, stakeholders of the system who know how the system is supposed to work and who are also in the business of serving children and families who are in our foster care system. And so they lifted up this issue and brought it to light to the department.
And without objection, I'll enter Exhibit 3 into the record. And finally, I want to turn your attention to Exhibit 4, which I will likewise enter into the record. This is a July 2022 letter from the Office of the Child Advocate in Georgia. In this letter, the Office of a Child Advocate, or OCA, writes to DFACS regarding, quote, systemic issues identified by child advocacy centers of Georgia and other CICs, finding that, quote, this is OCA's finding, in all cases reviewed as part of this investigation, in all cases reviewed, DFACS failed to take adequate steps to respond to allegations of physical and sexual abuse. And as I mentioned in my opening statement, in this same document, OCA continues to state that they encounter these same issues, quote, consistently throughout the state through OCA's day-to-day investigative work. So in 2021, we have a citizen review panel who is sounding the alarm on continued failure on risk assessment and safety response. In 2022, we have the Office of a Child Advocate identifying systemic issues to respond to allegations of physical and sexual abuse. Again, what does that mean? It means the bruising on Brooklyn's body. And OCA saying that, by the way, they encounter these same issues, quote, consistently throughout the state in OCA's day-to-day investigative work. This is another independent watchdog. Citizen review panels are one independent watchdog. OCA is another independent watchdog. According to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, DHS in Georgia, which runs DFACS, quote, vehemently denied OCA's finding that there were systemic issues impacting child safety. Here we have an internal document from DFACS itself finding, as you described it to us, the same 84% failure rate earlier this year on risk assessment and safety management, correct?
Correct.
Are you aware of, let me ask you the question this way. Based upon everything that you're seeing, do you believe that this agency is accepting, owning, taking responsibility for, and doing everything that they can, faced with multiple independent oversight bodies warning them for years of these issues and their own internal audits confirming these issues to fix them as fast as possible? Is that what you're seeing on the ground in Georgia?
No.
I want to thank you both for lending your expertise to this effort. And I want to emphasize a couple of things in closing. The first is that this is an ongoing inquiry. And so for members of the public who have information that we should be aware of, stories they want to share with the Senate, please reach out to the subcommittee. We'd love to hear from you. Second, I want to reemphasize something that we've touched on time and time again throughout this session, and it's not possible to say it enough. We're talking about children. We're talking about the most vulnerable children in the country. We're talking about the structures that exist for the purpose of providing sanctuary to the most vulnerable children in the country who have been through, in many cases, the most shocking and appalling forms of abuse. And so I want to again thank Ranking Member Blackburn for working together with me to shine a light on these issues, to empower experts, to offer suggestions for where we go from here. And let's all commit, everybody in Georgia, everybody in the Senate, everybody across the country, from this moment, let's commit to working together, being clear-eyed and honest with ourselves about the issues that we face, and saving the lives and opportunities that too many innocent children right now are being denied. Thank you for your testimony. Thank you all for attending. The record will remain open until November 15th for additional submissions. And with that, the subcommittee is adjourned.